Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Office for Human Research Protection's webinar series on the Common Rule. Today's webinar, Unlocking the Mysteries of the 46.111 Criteria for IRB Approval of Research, will be presented to you by Public Health Program Specialist Mariana Azar. This webinar will be recorded and will run for a total of 60 minutes, including a live Q&A session. If you have questions, please submit them through the chat. Certificates of attendance will be issued to all who have registered. The slides will be available on OHRP's website under the past events section, and the recording will be available in around a month. We will go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Zena, and thank you to our ASL interpreter, Beth. I trust that you can all see my slides. If you cannot, please let me know. All right. So disclaimer that we typically give before we get started. Any opinions that I may express during this presentation are my own and do not necessarily reflect the policy of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services or the Office for Human Research Protections. Any references to the regulatory provisions in the Common Rule in this presentation have been simplified to facilitate understanding. Always refer to the actual text of the Common Rule that is available on the OHRP website for a complete and accurate description of the regulatory requirements. The hyperlink that is provided on this slide will take you to that page. The learning objectives for this presentation are to examine the criteria for IRB review and approval of research in Section 111 of 45 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 46. Also known as the Common Rule. To consider what IRBs look for when reviewing research under the 111 criteria, and then to apply some of the 111 review criteria to case studies. Now, this presentation does include interactive quizzes, so be sure to stay alert and get ready to participate. Okay, before we jump into a discussion of the regulatory requirements, I do want to clarify what it means when we make the determination that the Common Rule regulatory requirements for the protection of human subjects in research actually apply. Now, the regulations apply to non-exempt human subjects research that is funded, supported, or conducted by the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, or another Common Rule department or agency. Now, when the Common Rule regulatory requirements apply, among other things, the regulations do stipulate that a body, referred to as an institutional review board or an IRB, is required to review and approve the research. And the regulations also include requirements for the IRB to have a specific defined membership, which my colleague Michael will explain in detail in the webinar he will deliver next week. Now, when the Common Rule regulatory requirements apply, there are also specific requirements to obtain and document informed consent from research participants, or to seek and obtain approval from the IRB for a waiver or alteration of these informed consent requirements. For a deeper dive on requirements for informed consent, visit our online education page to watch a video of a webinar devoted specifically to this topic. So, having established when the regulatory requirements apply, what are the regulatory criteria for IRB review and approval of research? Well, as I said before, the regulations at 45 CFR 111 outline criteria that an IRB shall consider and determine are satisfied to approve a research study. Among other things, the criteria address the need to minimize risks, to protect the privacy of subjects and the confidentiality of their data. And they also stipulate the need to equitably select subjects for research participation, as well as additional protections for subjects who may be vulnerable to coercion or undue influence. The 111 criteria also include requirements for limited IRB review, which I will not cover in this webinar. Tune in to the presentation my colleague Michael will deliver on IRB review mechanisms in 2 weeks from today for more unlimited IRB review requirements and processes. Now, note that if an IRB cannot make the applicable determinations required under the 111 review criteria, the research cannot be approved. Depending on the level of review, the IRB can outright disapprove a study. It can table it and defer it or seek input from subject area experts. Or it can return the study to the researcher so that the researcher can provide additional information, address IRB concerns or questions, and work with the IRB to make changes to their proposed research, and so on. So now let's look at these criteria on an individual basis. And let's start with the criterion that risks to subjects be minimized. The regulations state that this is to be done by using procedures that are consistent with sound research design, which do not unnecessarily expose subjects to risk, and whenever appropriate, by using procedures that are already being performed on the subjects for diagnostic or treatment purposes. Now, before we go any further, let's stop for a moment and ask a key question, that being, what is risk? How should we think about the concept of risk? So, risk is the possibility that something unpleasant or unwelcome will occur. Note that the idea of potentiality is built into the notion of risk. So merely the possibility that something could occur means that there is a risk of it happening. Now, this touches on the most challenging aspect of thinking about risk, and that is that it is rarely objectively or absolutely quantifiable. So it could be difficult for us to assess risk, but the regulations do provide some tools to guide us in this assessment. For example, the regulations do define minimal risk, and it's defined as the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research that are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. So risk, therefore, is a function of how severe and how likely something may be. So with this definition, research risks are compared to three standards of reference: daily life, routine physical examinations or tests, and routine psychological examinations or tests. So what else should we consider about risk? Well, when we look at the research question, this criterion should prompt us to ask if the research hypothesis is clear. And this is because part of minimizing risk is sound research design. And of course, that starts with a clear research hypothesis. So with respect to study design, this criterion then prompts us to consider if the design of the research is consistent with what the researcher actually needs to do in order to answer the research question. So if we're the IRB and we're applying this criterion to a research study, we can ask, does the researcher actually need this data or these specimens? Or are they just proposing to perform these procedures or collect this data or this specimen because of ease, because of poor research design, or perhaps, and quite worrisome, an unexplained research hypothesis? Now, once an IRB has looked at the research hypothesis and research design, it then needs to consider the procedures that will be performed for the research purposes and consider the likelihood and the seriousness of the risk that is posed by each of those procedures being performed for the purposes of the research. And once these risks are identified, it then needs to consider if there are appropriate measures to minimize these identified risks for the participants. So, for example, let's say that our research requires participants to undergo an MRI scan. So we'll need to consider the risk posed by this procedure and assess if the research is designed with appropriate measures to minimize these risks to participants. Now, this can be, for example, protocols to screen participants for metal implants and related objects in their bodies. Now, study subject inclusion and exclusion criteria is also a central consideration when it comes to risk. So in a study that is going to utilize something like an MRI scan, excluding populations with metal implants may be one way of appropriately using exclusion criteria to minimize risk. And of course, it all goes without saying that these are just some of the many considerations that may be applicable to any given planned or proposed research study. Of course, when assessing the risk of a study, we also need to think critically about the circumstances in which the risks may occur and who may be impacted. So let's use an example. Let's say that we are conducting research interviews on the mental and emotional toll that social media use may carry, the psychological risks. So if we're conducting interviews on mental and emotional toll of social media use, and this research carries the psychological risk because we're planning to ask sensitive and triggering questions. Now, this is likely to happen in the course of one's participation in the research. If our participants are also going to be identified with the responses that they give, and if their responses should include sensitive information, let's say information about their suicidal ideation or about peers that they may identify as cyberbullies that are responsible for their poor mental state, there may be the additional risk posed by the identifiability of the responses. And the impacted parties may be not only the participants themselves, but also those about whom our research participants disclose sensitive information. Now, as our prior example involves socio-behavioral research, I want to use this as an opportunity to highlight that social, behavioral, and education research, or SBER as it is most commonly referred to, or research that utilizes methods that are commonly employed in SBER, has its own particular considerations that are relevant when thinking about risks. So in SBER, risks are often less obvious and they're more difficult to identify. So an interview with an adult participant may on the surface appear to pose very little, if any, risk, but it's the topic of the interview, the location of the interview, the person with whom the interview is carried out. All of these things may elevate and complicate the risk assessment. So let's look at an example. So let's say that we plan to interview nurses for a research study on employer mandated vaccinations and requests for religious exemptions from said requirements. What you ask and how you ask it may pose various risks, including the risk of reputational damage, employability, and financial standing. And where you conduct the research may dictate this risk. So again, to stay with our example, if you decide to interview the nurse in a crowded hospital cafeteria, the risk of compromising her privacy and revealing her research participation and personal viewpoints may all be factors for consideration. Now, the thing about SBER is that there is a lack of empirical data on risks of social and behavioral research, which of course only further complicates the risk assessment. So while social or behavioral studies may not be inherently risky, they do require us to carefully think through what the potential harms might be when identifying risks and considering if they are minimized. Now, with that, while we've already touched on the concept of minimizing risks, let's look more broadly at what an IRB can consider when it considers if risks have indeed been minimized. Now, note that the regulations do require that the risks be minimized and reasonable, not eliminated entirely. And this is an important consideration because some risks simply cannot be eliminated completely. But to minimize risk, we can take various steps, including choosing to conduct our research using procedures or methods that are less risky. So for example, opting for X-ray rather than MRI imaging if X-ray imaging is sufficient for the purposes of our research. We can also take precautions to decrease the likelihood of harms occurring. And if a harm does occur, the IRB can ensure that the study includes contingency procedures to address this. So if our study was designed to decrease the likelihood of a harm, such as the risk of a fall in an elderly population participating in a study that involves walking, if several participants do experience falls in our hypothetical study in the course of their participation, our study would need to have been designed in ways that include contingency procedures to address the occurrence of this harm. Now, one additional specific way of minimizing research-related risks is to piggyback on clinical procedures that will be conducted regardless of the research. So, for example, if somebody is already scheduled to undergo imaging for clinical care purposes, using that same scan to collect data for research purposes is one way of minimizing risk, because that way you're collecting data from procedures that would have been performed anyway, rather than introducing a risk with a research-exclusive procedure. Okay, and with that, let's take a look at a case study and consider how the criterion of minimizing risks to subjects can be applied. So if you've been listening to this webinar in the background while multitasking, let this also serve as a warning that you are about to be quizzed. So consider a study in which researchers plan to collect data from 200 adults to map the physiological changes in the body that occur due to exercise. So our study aims to measure physiological changes before, during, and after exercise. And to do this, we're going to recruit sedentary adults and assign them either to an endurance training regimen that involves stuff like walking on a treadmill or cycling, or a resistance training regimen that can involve things like weightlifting. Okay, so in this hypothetical research study, what are some ways in which the risks of exercise-related injuries could be minimized? Now, a quiz should have populated on your screen as a pop-up window, and I see it there. So select all the ways in which the risk of exercise-related injuries could be minimized. And I'm going to read these out for accessibility purposes. So option 1, study team must include a certified fitness trainer with experience teaching exercises to sedentary people. Option 2, participants must wear proper attire, including shoes for the exercise activities. Option 3, a television should be within viewing distance of participants during exercise activities. And option 4, participants must warm up before exercise to avoid injury. Oh, and these are coming in so fast. All right, so I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, 2 more seconds. All right. Okay, I'm going to show you the results. Okay, yeah, so of course, options 1, 2, and 4 are all ways that the risk of exercise-related injury can be minimized. Option 3 is just a way of keeping your participants entertained during their exercise. Okay, so moving on to our next criterion. All right, so the regulations also stipulate that risks to subjects be reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits, if there are any, as well as the importance of the knowledge that may reasonably be expected to result from the research. So crudely put, this criterion amounts to conducting a risk-benefit analysis of the proposed research. Okay, so what questions should we ask when making a risk-benefit assessment? Well, we can start by asking about the risks and their likelihood and magnitude. So if we go back to the example from the quiz that we just had, we could say that the primary risk of our exercise study is injury from the falls or strains. And the risk of falls or strains happening is going to be minimal, hopefully, because we've implemented measures to minimize these risks. So then we would go on to ask about the prospect of direct benefit. Now, for our study, there is probably little, if any, direct benefit to our participants. So once we establish that, we can ask about the knowledge that might be gained. And let's just assume, for the purposes of this exercise, that the principal benefit of this research is going to be the general knowledge that is going to be gained about the physiological impact of exercise on the human body. Okay, so then we need to consider the risks and whether they're reasonable in anticipation of the benefits that we've identified, while simultaneously taking into consideration the importance of the knowledge that is to be gained. Now, there is probably, again, little to no direct benefit to our research participants directly. The principal benefit of this research is going to be to the general public and the general knowledge that would be gained. And let's just assume that the knowledge about the positive ways that exercise impacts the human body is indeed important and worthwhile knowledge for us to have. So these are the facts that we would need to consider when weighing whether the minimal risk of injury or falls is balanced against the knowledge that is to be gained from this research. Okay, so again, in our example, the other thing that I want to point out is that in our example, the risks are going to be borne by individuals that are participating, whereas the benefits are not going to accrue to the individual participants, but to the general public more broadly. Now, this is not uncommon in cases of non-therapeutic or social and behavioral research, in which very often subjects do not benefit directly. So the key to the risk-benefit assessment is balance, and it's also important to keep into consideration that this balance may not apply to individual participants. Okay. The other thing that I want to point out about this is that all of this is going to be highly subjective, right? So it's very important to develop and follow a framework to reduce subjectivity and treat similar research and similar fact patterns about the research in a similar way. Okay, so we can aim to develop a framework, but of course, there's not going to be a formula for conducting a risk-benefit analysis. But there are going to be general concepts that we can employ, and these can include, for example, if there is no direct benefit, then serious risks may be justified only if the knowledge that is to be gained is important and cannot be obtained otherwise. If there is going to be a direct benefit to the participants, then the reasonable amount of risk may be justifiable. If we're studying a new treatment, the risk of the research should generally be no higher than the risk posed by the available treatments, unless the research risk is justified by potential benefits. And wherever it's applicable, consider if a placebo should be used when an accepted therapy exists. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a look at another case study. Now, in this case study, researchers are conducting a study to examine the prevalence of migraines in African American men ages 18 to 55. Our participants are going to complete a questionnaire. They're going to provide a blood sample, and they're also going to undergo a lumbar puncture. Now, the risks of this research include a breach of privacy and confidentiality, bruising, various side effects from the lumbar puncture, and potential distress from completing the research questionnaires. The benefits are going to include contributions to generalizable knowledge, as well as scientific progress more broadly. Okay, so I have another quiz here. Are the risks to subjects reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits of our migraine study? Option 1, probably yes. Option 2, probably not. And option 3, it depends. And I'll give you a few seconds to complete this. Okay, 2 more seconds. Okay. That's interesting. Okay, well, so I'm going to make an argument that the answer is probably not. And that seems to be contrary to what the rest of you seem to think, but here's why I'm going to make that argument. Now, I'm going to say probably not, because the risk of a lumbar puncture can be rather serious, and there is no direct benefit to the participants in this research. The risks are not necessarily minimal here. So the benefit of contribution to generalizable knowledge may not be sufficient and reasonable in relation to the anticipated risks that are borne by the individual study participants. Now, of course, we don't have all the details here, right? So I'm conditioning my response with probably, because additional information may indeed change this determination, leading us to the it depends response. Okay. So moving on to the criterion that selection of subjects be equitable. So what do we consider when applying this review criterion to research? Well, here an IRB may look at who the target population is, and they can ask if the specified target population is appropriate for answering the research question. And it may also consider if the research team has adequately explained their inclusion and exclusion criteria. And they can also ask, does the target population represent the group that will benefit from the knowledge gained through the research? So in our migraine study example, African American men were selected to participate, so they were the target population. Now, in considering if the selection of subjects is equitable, an IRB can ask why African American men specifically are the target population for this research. Do African American men have a higher prevalence of migraines than the general population? Is there something about the way that African American men experience migraines or respond to available medications for migraines that warrant this research? If we have answers to these questions that are sufficiently satisfactory, we can look deeper at the inclusion criteria. So the researchers in our hypothetical study are only including African American men ages 18 to 55. But let's say that the scientific literature suggests that men ages 55 to 65 have a higher prevalence of migraines than their younger cohort. So with that fact in mind, is the inclusion criteria sufficiently inclusive here? What are the reasons for excluding men ages 55 to 65? Is there a scientifically valid reason for this exclusion, such as the likelihood that they suffer from other medical conditions that may also cause migraines? And the focus of this specific research is on migraines that do not stem from other diagnosed conditions, such as, for example, high blood pressure. So all of this is to say that the IRB needs to carefully consider who researchers are proposing to include and exclude for participation and why, and offer clear explanation and justification for the criteria for IRB consideration. And of course, if our specified target population also includes subjects who are potentially vulnerable, so for example, African-American men ages 55 to 65 with diminished cognitive capacity, we need to think about the additional safeguards that may be necessary for their involvement in our research. Now, note that there is an interesting intersection between equitable selection of subjects and reasonable risk-benefit considerations. When we talked about a fair distribution of the burdens and benefits of research, we talked about understanding who would bear the burdens and who would receive the benefits of the research. Now, this consideration also factors into considerations of equitable selection of research participants. If I state it otherwise, if there are benefits to be gained from the research, perhaps our aim should be to maximize these benefits by expanding the reach of the research. So if you're proposing to conduct a study on behavioral modification techniques and smoking cessation, and you cite the high likelihood of helping participants quit smoking as a direct benefit of the research, well, then perhaps the research should be expanded to benefit the maximum or the most diverse number of participants that it can. Even when the benefits are likely indirect, the research population should be diverse enough so that the benefits can be generalizable to the broadest possible group. Likewise, when we talk about the burdens and look at research burdens from the perspective of equitable selection of subjects, we can see that burdens such as the time, the effort, the cost of research participation may all undermine inclusion efforts because some populations, including those who may be otherwise economically or educationally disadvantaged, may not be able to accept or accommodate these burdens for the sake of research participation. So if your study requires travel to a hospital in the middle of a workday, this may pose the burden of loss of time and possibly wages, never mind the effort of travel, childcare accommodations, and related. So when you look at things from this perspective, it's important to consider measures that could be taken to lessen the burdens of participation on prospective research participants. This includes meeting participants where they are on their own time and, where applicable, providing them with accommodations to ease the burdens of research participation. Okay, now moving on to our next criterion, the requirement that informed consent be obtained and documented before beginning any research activities. Now, beyond seeking and documenting informed consent, note that the informed consent must provide information that is needed for to make an informed decision about participation. And it must be in a language that is understandable to the potential participant under circumstances that provide voluntariness. This means thinking about what information is the relevant information for informed decision-making, and keeping in mind that too much information may overwhelm a prospective participant. But on the other hand, an insufficient amount of detail may result in a participant making a decision without all of the relevant facts in mind. This requirement also stipulates that we provide information in language understandable to potential participants. So the goal here must be to write in plain language and clearly describe complex concepts and procedures from the participant's perspective. Consent also needs to be obtained under circumstances that provide voluntariness. Now, among other things, here we can consider if common practices like seeking same-day consent in the clinic promote voluntariness, as well as consider who seeks consent, how that consent is sought by that person, using what tools, documents, study guides, and other helpful materials, and so on. Now, of course, informed consent considerations and even requirements can be challenging, and this is true for both researchers and for IRBs. But it's very important to keep in mind that informed consent is crucial for research and public trust in research. And this is because informed consent is the application of the ethical principle of respect for persons. It is the recognition that people must make decisions about research participation for themselves in accordance with their values and their opinions. And moreover, that those whose autonomy may be compromised, such as the elderly or those whose cognitive capacity has been diminished as a result of illness, should be offered additional protections to ensure voluntariness and informed decision-making about research participation. Now, for more on this criterion, I've already mentioned the webinar, but in addition to the webinar, if you're curious about the regulatory requirements, do visit our website and check out the FAQ that we have available on this topic. Okay, so shifting gears and moving on to our next criterion. In some cases, the IRB may also require additional data monitoring, and this is to ensure the safety of subjects. Now, this is typically done by requiring a data safety monitoring plan or a board or another plan to monitor the data that is being collected in the research. Now, this can be relevant in the case of something like, let's say, a multi-site double-blind clinical study where the data safety monitoring board serves the function of raising alarms, for example, let's say about identified safety concerns or adverse events to ensure the safety of subjects. Now, we've touched on this criterion already, but another important criterion pertains to adequate provisions to protect the privacy of participants and to maintain the confidentiality of the research data. Now, when evaluating research on the basis of this criterion, we can consider if personally identifiable data will be protected to the extent possible from unauthorized access or use, and if there are any special privacy and confidentiality issues that should be addressed, such as additional or special confidentiality protections for something like genetic information. Okay, so let's apply this review criterion to a case study in which researchers will qualitatively examine and describe the ways in which trans people experience sexuality and describe connections between gender and sexuality. Now, the researchers in this example will conduct individual and focus group interviews at a faculty lounge at the university, and they'll use their personal cell phones to audio record the individual and focus group interviews. Okay, so what are some study design changes that might better protect the privacy of participants in this research and the confidentiality of their research data? So select all that apply once the quiz pops up on your screen. And there you go. All right, so option one, they can conduct individual and focus group interviews in a private space. Option two, they can notify focus group participants not to discuss what is said by others. And option three, they can use a digital voice recorder to record the interviews. And four, they can store all research data on a personal computer connected to public Wi-Fi. So select all that apply. I'm going to give you 2 more seconds. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you are seeing the results. Well, and I agree with the responses. So instead of conducting the interviews in the faculty lounge, they can conduct them in a private space instead. This will, of course, minimize the risk that those not involved in or with the research may overhear the discussion and disclose the things that are being shared by the participants. For the focus group interviews, participants can be notified and asked to confirm that they will not disclose information that is shared by others with those outside of the research. And of course, with respect to protecting the confidentiality of the data, the researchers can use a standalone digital voice recorder rather than something like a personal cell phone to record the interviews. Now, this is, of course, because cell phones are less secure and prone to data breaches and data loss. But even if we use a digital recorder, how it's going to be stored and how and where the data from this recorder is going to be transferred and stored are also going to be key considerations for safeguarding research data for something like the research that we have in this example. Okay, now, as I mentioned earlier, the 111 review criteria also require additional safeguards and protections for subjects that are vulnerable to coercion or undue influence. And this includes those with impaired decision-making capacity and those who may be economically or educationally disadvantaged. Now, when these populations are involved in research, this criterion calls on us to consider the kind of vulnerabilities our participants may have. Specifically, we can ask, are these vulnerabilities intrinsic? Now, an intrinsic vulnerability can be something like a limitation on mental capacity because of age or illness, or something like a degenerative brain disease. Alternatively, we can ask if the vulnerability is extrinsic, or alternatively, if it exists by virtue of an external factor, such as one's socioeconomic status, education level, immigration status, and so on. Once we've established the nature and the source of a potential vulnerability, we can assess what measures can be put in place to lessen or reverse the situation or the impact of an intrinsic vulnerability. So as an example, if we enroll someone with a degenerative brain disease while their mental faculties are relatively intact, the research can be designed in such a way that there are periodic assessments of mental capacity to ensure sufficient capacity for self-determination and the ability to continue to make an informed decision about participation throughout the duration of the study. Alternatively, if the research aims to enroll subjects that are educationally disadvantaged, additional protections may involve presenting information about the research in very plain language, and then other ways that would ensure comprehension, understanding, and appreciation of what the research entails. Of course, in addition to subpart A and the 111 review criteria included therein, the regulations at 45 CFR 46 include 3 additional subparts, which outline additional requirements for reviewing research that involve pregnant women and fetuses, prisoners, and children. This is to say that in addition to considerations for protecting subjects who may be vulnerable to coercion or undue influence, additional considerations may apply if the subparts are covered by, if the research and the subjects therein are covered by subparts B, C, or D. Okay, so we've spent a great deal of time talking about the IRB, so I want to take a moment to also talk about the role that researchers play in the overall process of submitting studies for IRB review and working with the IRB to ensure that the rights and welfare of research participants are protected. Now, it goes without saying that a natural starting point in all of this is learning the regulatory requirements and the ethical principles that underline these requirements. Now, of course, there are going to be nuances and specifics within the regulatory requirements that require skill in learning them and properly applying them. But if you take a bird's eye look at the regulatory requirements, they're simply direct applications of the ethical principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And when you look at things from this perspective, researchers have a responsibility to be ethical in the design and conduct of their research, which means thinking about research critically, keeping in mind the regulations, but also keeping in mind the ethical principles that underline these regulations. Now, in the same vein, researchers also need to remember that conducting research is not a right. It is a privilege. Research participants are not an end to satisfy a researcher's goals. They are persons who must be respected and whose participation in research must be voluntary. So researchers must respect, value, and also get to know and understand their research participants so that they can design research with them in mind and conduct research in responsible and respectful ways. Now, similarly, researchers should also aim to submit clear, complete, and mutually consistent research proposals and associated documents to the IRB for review. They should also follow their institution's submission guidelines and policies, allow the IRB sufficient time to review their study, and respond to any questions and requests for changes that the IRB might have. Once a study is approved, researchers also need to work with the IRB on any amendments, requests for continuing approval, reports of any unanticipated problems, noncompliance, and so on. In short, maintaining a collegial relationship with an IRB and being responsive to an IRB's work and mission should be a priority for all researchers. And with that, I would like to take a moment to highlight some educational resources that OHRP has available on our website. Now, you can follow the link on this slide to access the Division of Education and Development's page, where you can find many helpful tutorials, videos, and training modules to help you navigate through the regulatory requirements, as well as the ethical considerations for conducting human subjects research. Now, one item specifically that I'd like to focus on directly is our considerations for reviewing human subjects research interactive programs. Now, to date, we've developed 3 separate scenarios exploring the 111 review criteria of equitable selection of subjects, minimizing risks, and balancing risks and benefits. Now, taking a look at these interactive scenarios is a great way to get insight into the ways researchers and IRBs can navigate through these criteria using hypothetical research studies. You can even test your knowledge with embedded quiz questions and download a completion certificate at the end of each lesson. And it goes without saying that this training, like all the content on our website, is free. There are also some upcoming educational events that I'd like to bring to your attention. And the first is our 6th annual Exploratory Workshop. So this year's event is going to explore the ethical and practical considerations of psychedelics research involving human participants. Now, this is, of course, a very timely and very popular topic, and we hope that many of you will join us at this event via free live stream on September 14th. The full agenda for this event, and that includes the speaker information and session descriptions, is now available on our website. So do visit and check it out. And while you're there, also check out the agenda for our upcoming Research Community Forum with the University of Michigan on September 26th and 27th. More information about this event, including the complete agenda, are available on the link provided on this slide. Now, last but not least, I do want to highlight our email address. You all know that we are a very small office with a very small team, but we are always happy to engage with the research community and answer your questions about the Common Rule regulatory requirements. Please do email us at ohrp@hhs.gov if you have any questions about the regulatory requirements, and we will do our best to answer your questions. Regulatory guidance, FAQs, and other helpful resources. You can also find them on our website. While you're there, you can also complete our human research protection training and view the additional educational and regulatory content we've made available to the research community. And with that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mariana. That was very informative as always. For those of you wanting to ask questions now for Mariana to answer, please insert them into the chat and I'll do my best to get to them, and any questions that we aren't able to answer within time, we'll supply an email response. A couple of things right off the bat. This was our first time trying out this interactive quiz scenario. So apologies for not being able to show the results of the quiz. We'll work on this and figure out a solution, either having it displayed or possibly we'll read out in the future. But I thank you for bearing with us while we try this, and hopefully you enjoyed it being a little bit more interactive. Additionally, the slides and the recording of the presentation will be posted hopefully in a couple of weeks. It might take a little bit longer. We have to go through what's known as 508 compliance to make sure that the slides and the webinar are available to all. And so this entails formatting and just making sure that the closed captions are correct, things of this nature. So let me just kind of get those things out of the way, the bookkeeping out of the way.
And apologies, on my end, I was seeing the results. I assumed the rest of you were too.
Well, we know that apparently the majority of the audience disagreed with you on one question from your response. Yeah, so let's hop to it, and let me see if I can get some questions for you here. Apologies as my mouse is acting up. So we have one of the first questions, and this is kind of a good one, Mariana. Let's see how you deal with this one. Should we take into account the daily life of research participants when determining minimal risk? That is, does an office worker have a lower minimal risk than a person working on an offshore oil drilling platform, for example. So I guess kind of when you talk about the everyday activities
Yeah.
for a participant, are you taking into account that individual participant or perhaps the research population that you're studying as a whole, or what?
As well as the research question itself and the research procedures, right? So the minimal risk assessment and determination takes all of those factors into consideration. And so if you are, again, to go back to the example that we used in the study, if you're conducting research that does pose the quote unquote minimal risk of, let's say, something like reputational damage, financial standing, employability, that may vary for the office worker versus the person that is working in, I don't know, some kind of dangerous environment where the responses that they give may have additional ramifications for their employer, right? So yes, all of those factors, all the specifics, all the nuances of one's standing, of the research and the risks that that research may pose to you specifically are all things that need to be considered. Did you want to add to that, Michael?
No, that's pretty thorough. I think the kind of one of the duties of the IRB and of the IRB office, those who are reviewing research, are to make sure that everything's tailored to that research population, right? So
Right.
you always want to make sure that everyone's fully protected. So I think your answer is fantastic, is satisfactory. And let's see, we have a comment here, I guess in reference to your CBER versus clinical or therapeutic research. Direct benefits to participants are not less frequent for behavioral and social sciences research than biomedical research. Peter believes this is a fallacy and that there's data to support his position. So
Yeah,
just
that's an
something
important
that,
observation. Yeah,
yeah.
and Peter, by the way, if you could email us the applicable research for our own consideration, that would be
Yeah.
helpful to us as well. Because Michael, I'm sure you'll agree, this is a thing that we frequently say, but indeed, if there is data to indicate the contrary, if there's research data that shows that there are direct benefits to participants in SBER studies, it would be very helpful for us to have this information.
And that can be sent to ohrp at HHS.gov. And we'd be happy to include that.
Yep.
Here we have some comments, and I guess some questions regarding your scenario with the lumbar puncture, and I guess with it being more than minimal risk. So we have a comment about what if it's kind of ordered for routine clinical care? How would that factor in if it's clinical care versus research, and you had access to the lumbar puncture results?
Yeah, so if you recall, one of the things that we did talk about when we talked about ways that we could minimize risk is by piggybacking on procedures that would otherwise be performed for clinical purposes, irrespective of the research. And sure, of course, yes, that would be a major consideration, and it would be a factor to consider when considering the risk of the research. If the lumbar puncture is being performed anyway, and you're simply getting the data from that procedure and then using it for the purposes of your research, it's not going to be a procedure that's being performed exclusively for the research. So yes, absolutely, that would be a key consideration.
And like you said, it'd be great for minimizing risk anytime you can
Right.
piggyback on a clinical.
I think that's Yvonne under my name
Yvonne,
with her hand raised.
please, Yvonne.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. So be careful with that, because if it's piggybacking in the sense that, the lumbar puncture is being done for clinical purpose anyway, and that you're not doing anything extra for the purpose of the research, then yes, and it's just the risk from the clinical care, right? So you wouldn't even consider that as risk of the research. However, if you are piggybacking the actual puncture procedure, but you are actually going to get extra
Right.
lumbar, the extra spinal fluid
Yep.
to contribute to your research, then you have to consider that extra amount that you're getting to see if that, how to what extent that particular part is contributing to risk, and that part will then be considered as research risk, because you're directly doing something specifically for the purpose of the research. So just be very careful when you think about those things. It's not just, piggybacking the procedure and then you'll be fine, but it's also like, what are you doing exactly that adds to, or that contributes directly and adds to the risk?
Yep.
Just a bit of clarification, I thought.
Yep.
Thank you, Yvonne. So we have, could you please elaborate on determining the potential of direct or indirect benefit? Does the benefit need to be sustained? Or, for example, could the potential benefit only occur during the intervention session? For example, an intervention that increases exercise tolerance. So I guess here, does it need to be a sustained benefit, ongoing, or could it be possibly brief?
Yvonne, do you have your hand up again, or is that from before? You're still muted. Okay, but the hand went down. So I'm going to give you our favorite answer. It depends, right? And it is going to depend. It's going to depend for the purposes of the risk benefit assessment. So I'm thinking specifically on, for example, a lot of the studies that we've been seeing that do involve psychedelic substances and the direct benefit that is experienced by the participants at the point of ingesting the psychedelic substance and in the course of their immediate participation thereafter. Now, that's potentially not a sustained benefit. It's a one-off, right? And it's something that you need to consider versus the possibility of having access to this substance moving forward or continuing participation. So I think all these things are going to be specific to the research, right? They're going to be specific to the risks that are at hand and to the risk benefit analysis. So it's difficult to say definitively always in all cases the benefit must be, let's say, longitudinal or sustained or otherwise prolonged in duration versus immediate at the point of research. In some instances, that may be something that you want to consider. In other instances, it may not even be a possibility. There may only be the possibility of experiencing the direct benefit at the point of research participation.
Thank you. So we have a question here. It's a little bit broad, but it'll provide an opportunity for you to speak on some of these points. How do you handle the enrollment of vulnerable populations in international settings? So I guess we're talking about international research, non-domestic, outside the United States. Possibly, I don't have the information here, but with a United States research partner or United States institution conducting the research. Let's talk about that for a little bit,
Do you want to
Mariana.
take a stab at that, Michael? Because I mean, I think that there's a lot to consider here.
There's a lot to consider. So of course, you would want to adhere to all of the common rule requirements that we have with vulnerable populations, but then you also have to be sensitive to the local customs, laws, and we actually have an international compilation that's available on our website where we do our best to try to update it every few years with the regulations and laws that we find of other countries. So that'd be a good starting spot to see if there's any additional protections that are in place in those countries. I like the idea of getting together a CAB, a community advisory board. And these are the kind of local community leaders, and they can kind of cue you in on local customs, things you should or should not be doing. They have the information that you'll need to offer these additional protections. That's just real brief. Mariana, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if the research involves also partnering with local researchers or hiring local individuals for the purposes of facilitating that recruitment, that too needs to be considered, right? So let's say you're conducting research on a sensitive topic, for example, HIV status or sexual orientation, and you're going to rely on local individuals to help you recruit subjects. Now, these individuals may be members of the community, and so let's say reviewing the eligibility criteria or even sharing information about the research with those that they may be familiar with may in and of itself pose a risk to those that may be interested in participating, because in expressing their interest or, you know, even preemptively indicating that they may satisfy the eligibility criteria, they may be disclosing something that may be sensitive or may pose a risk to them as a result of that disclosure. So who you work with on the ground matters, how you provide training to those individuals. I'm not even going into the considerations of whether these are members of the research team engaged in the research and so forth. But, you know, it's difficult. I mean, with international research, there's a lot to consider. And my experience with international research has been largely social and behavioral, where there's been this kind of like, I don't want to say nonchalant, but this sense of, you know, the the risk that is posed is not greater than minimal. And so the things that I do and the people that I'm going to work with on the ground, I don't really need to think through those things beyond what I've done already. And I think that that's not necessarily true. I also think that there is a very common practice of conducting international research while staying domestic. So from afar, if you will, not really being on the ground to see what goes on. I've seen those studies too, and I've seen a lot of things happen in those studies that could have been avoided had there indeed been feet on the ground. So I think that there is the need to really be mindful of, what you know and what you don't know and what you need to know in order to conduct international research responsibly.
Thank you. And this is kind of slightly related to it, or it could be. Would you mind discussing some ways to manage non-English speaking participants with the criteria for approval for informed consent and translation?
Yeah, so there are specific requirements. We also have an FAQ on this topic, and I do encourage you to check that out. But of course, when you're involving non-English speaking subjects in your research, you do need to be cognizant of the requirements for translating the consent forms, the situations in which the use of a short form consent is appropriate and where it's not, the training that is required for the translators, whether those translators are going to serve the role of also witnessing the signature on the consent form. I mean, there's a lot that goes into research involving non-English speaking subjects. And the other thing, I mean, Michael, we get this question a lot when we're in the field and providing education and outreach. It seems that a lot of researchers also struggle with ensuring that they have adequate translation services. That's something you need to think about prospectively, right? At the point that you're designing your research, at the point that you're thinking through the possibility that non-English speaking participants will be involved. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to face the situation where you do have a non-English speaking subject and you don't have the necessary plan or accommodations in place to be able to properly enroll them in your research. So again, there's a lot that goes into it. I think that, just be mindful, take a look at that FAQ and really think through those things at the point that you're submitting your study to the IRB for review.
Yeah, and just to add one thing, and as we frequently work with some universities and colleges, oftentimes, and even in hospitals, there's someone already in your institution who might be speaking the language of the participant. And so these could possibly be free or low-cost resources that you can utilize. I often find people are willing to help, they just don't know how. And so you can start by asking your colleagues.
And actually, as a cautionary note, one thing that I've been hearing a lot from colleagues is IRB proposals are now coming in with the section pertaining to non-English speaking subjects, addressing that question as AI will perform the translation, meaning like ChatGPT will be utilized for the purposes of translating. Be careful, right? I mean, because the accuracy and I think that there's a lot that a lot of this is new technology. A lot of it isn't, right? A lot of this is established technology. If you have access to that, great. But I think that there is just this tendency to embrace something that's new and readily available and think that it's going to satisfy the purpose of providing the information correctly, right? And giving them the information that they need to make an informed decision about research participation. Considering the importance of informed consent, do you really want to rely on something like ChatGPT to perform that translation for you without having that additional step of having someone qualified vet the quality of that translation? I would be wary. I would be careful, and I would be very thoughtful about the use of these technologies for these purposes.
Yeah, certainly it is the responsibility of the IRB to make sure that the document is translated properly. And so they can ask for a verification from a human translator, if you will, to make sure that anything like that would meet all the requirements. So here's a great question for you, one that we receive periodically, and might be our last one as well. Is the common rule only applicable to, and I'll say non-exempt human subjects research funded by HHS, or is it also applicable beyond those projects funded by HHS, Health and Human Services?
So the common rule is applicable to research that is funded, conducted, or supported by the Department of Health and Human Services or any of the other 20 common rule departments or agencies. It is also applicable to institutions that have voluntarily chosen to what we refer to as check the box on their federal-wide assurance. Now, there's no expectation, there's no requirement that institutions do this. This is a purely voluntary measure that they take, and it's also one that is going to be eliminated in the sometime in the future. Let's leave it at that. But it's applicable beyond just research with immediate funding from the Department of Health and Human Services, which could include the NIH, BARDA, and other institutes within the HHS. But yes, we hear that question quite often. It is something that comes up, and I think be careful. And when we ask if research is HHS funded or conducted, keep in mind that HHS is made up of a lot of things, right? And so when we ask that question, and we do ask that question, especially when we get questions in the inbox, think about what that means, right? And if you don't know what it means for something to be HHS funded, ask us and we'll provide you with additional information so that you can make that assessment.
And I would just add, we're the government authorities for that research that's funded by Health and Human Services. So we can talk about the common rule, but if you have research that's supported or conducted in part by, say, Department of Defense, we are not the authority. We can't speak to DoD research, things like that. Well, Mariana, we're at time. Do you have any closing remarks? And for those questions we did get to answer, we will email you and certainly make sure that you have a satisfactory response. Mariana, closing, please.
Join Michael next week and the week thereafter to learn more about the things that we touched on in this presentation, but didn't go into in detail. And thank you, as always, for joining us and for participating and for your wonderful questions.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.